Magic items are some of the most exciting and interesting things about fantasy. There's just something about having a tangible physical object that you can hold in your hands be the thing that's breaking the rules of reality. That's deeply satisfying. Part of this appeal is often just that they look really cool. This is true even when you're reading a book and you have to create the imagery in your head to match the words as you read along. But it's even more true for visual media, which nowadays especially is usually the thing that can catapult a fantasy series to massive mainstream popularity where everyone's heard of it. If you're making a movie and you give a character a magic item, you've now also just given yourself the opportunity to create an amazing visual spectacle. You now get to include props with interesting and unique designs, and then you get to apply a ton of cool visual effects on top of that. Things that can fly, things that can turn invisible, and lots of things that emanate glowing light. Magic weapons in particular benefit from this visual appeal. Imagine for a second if lightsabers didn't have that glowing plasma effect going on and they just looked like a regular piece of metal. Even if they could still cut through everything and behaved exactly like a lightsaber, without that special look to them, I doubt they would have become anywhere near as popular. Glowing swords just look really cool. That's why we see so many of them, along with a fair few hammers and axes. Magic items also open up all kinds of new possibilities for a storyline, because unlike most magic powers, magic items are transferable. They can be passed down from a master to his apprentice, symbolizing the hero's progress. They can be something that once belonged to a fallen companion, reminding the hero of what they've lost or strengthening their resolve to avenge them. They can be stolen and recovered, setting up conflict. They can be handed out as rewards, which works great for video games as well as anything involving a quest. In fact, you can have quests that are all about finding a magic item, or taking it somewhere, or restoring its power, or destroying it for good. They can drive the entire plot because of the way stuff appeals to our basic instincts to acquire resources. And in a story, this can go far beyond anything we see in reality, because our desire would be stronger if these items granted actual power beyond anything you can see in the real world. If making more money didn't just give you a more pleasurable life, but instead gave you the option to get your hands on stuff that would let you break the laws of physics, that would become a driving ambition in its own right. That would change the way people behave in their daily lives as they scramble to get some of these things. And that's an interesting idea to think about. Then you have my absolute favourite thing about magic items. They allow a story to include creative problem solving by adding more tools to a character's belt in a quick and simple way without overcomplicating everything. Let's say you want to let a character carry a bunch of extra stuff around with them. Well, you could create an entire magic system based around creating extra dimensional spaces. But then you've got a lot of extra questions you have to answer. Questions like, what are the rules this magic works by, and how many people are able to use it? Because how you answer those questions has a massive impact on the world you're creating. In this example, things like shipping and transportation would become completely different if one person with access to this magic could carry a ton of stuff around with them. Trade caravans would probably not exist in such a world. Neither would large ships, when a small one transporting a single individual could serve the same purpose. And if you do this multiple times, adding in entirely new branches of magic for each thing you want to include in the story, then the way they interact with each other and the world around them ends up consuming the entire setting, and the whole story becomes radically different. Or, instead of doing all of that, you could just give your character a classic bag of holding. This still lets you play around with all the ideas of having extra carrying capacity. They can still carry a massive arsenal of weapons around with them, they can still camp out anywhere, they can still loot everything in sight, but now it's being done without creating a ripple effect that alters the entire setting. This way you can save that kind of thing for the magic systems that you do want to explore the most, that will alter the entire world in interesting ways. The same goes for a sentient piece of clothing that lets you introduce a fun new character without having to think through whether sentient objects have rights in this world. Or a shape-changing sword that lets you make fights more interesting without having to alter the entire world's military strategy. Or a map that shows people's locations but doesn't require you to think through the implications of introducing what's basically GPS technology to a medieval fantasy setting. Magic items let you play around with ideas as a kind of interesting extra because of the limits imposed on them by being a unique object. And as I'll explain in a second, limits are the most interesting part of how magic works in stories. So if you want to know how people came up with the most iconic magic items, or come up with some for yourself, then we need to know how to think of interesting magical effects, and even more importantly, interesting limitations on those effects. Now, the most obvious approach you can take is just to take a real world object and then make it slightly better. This is what gets you the classic +1 sword, but when you think about it, there's something about a sword that does slightly more damage or armor that has slightly better resistance that isn't that interesting. It doesn't change what you can do as much as how well you can do something. You see this a lot in video games because every effect has to be programmed in. This is a ton of work, so instead you get weapons and armor with slightly higher numbers attached to it, and that's it. When you're writing a story, you don't have to worry about any of this extra work. The magic items you come up with can do anything you can imagine, but the way to make them really interesting is to focus on what they can't do. The idea that the limitations you place on magic are the most important aspect comes from Brandon Sanderson's Laws of Magic systems. And the whole idea here is that it's what you can't do that generates conflict. An item that can do anything or is just ridiculously overpowered doesn't cause any conflict beyond the need to get your hands on it in the first place. If there's an item that grants wishes or a weapon that wins every fight, then the character actually using it with any regularity would completely break the tension. Items like this can only ever be a plot device that comes into play right at the end. Having strong limits to your magic items stops this from happening and lets them be part of the journey instead of something that's waiting at the destination. So with all that in mind, the best way to make an interesting magic item is to look at the limits that object has in the real world, remove one of them to give it more power, and then add a new limit in to make that power interesting. Okay, so let's take the example of a sword, because I've mentioned them a few times so far in this video. So what are the limits that a sword has in the real world? Well, to cut something with a sword, you have to be holding it. Remove that limitation and you have a sword that you can control telekinetically. Here's another limit. A sword can only cut something when it's pressed against it. Remove that limit and you have a sword that now has a kind of phantom range that extends outwards from where it appears to be. Either of those magic swords could show up in a fantasy story and they would not be out of place in the slightest. But to make them especially interesting, you'd have to put new limits on those magical effects. With the telekinetic sword, you'd probably include a maximum range from the user it can work at. With the phantom range sword, you'd probably put a time limit on how long you can use it for. But there's a level even beyond this kind of thing. To make an object really interesting, you should make the limit you're removing from it and the limit you're placing on it part of the same effect. So let's say you start with the limit on sharpness. A sword cuts things limited by its sharpness compared to the hardness of the object it's cutting through. Normally, if you remove this limit, you end up with the fairly standard, slightly sharper sword. But what if instead of removing that limit, you reversed it? This would give you a reverse sharpness sword that cuts through hard objects easily and can't cut through soft objects at all. Well, now we've got the kind of thing that's interesting to think about. This thing would cleave through armor and struggle with the flesh beneath it. And that cloth-wearing, normally squishy wizard would be practically invulnerable to it. It would completely change the flow of fights in an interesting way, instead of just making them easier. You could also include items that alter the flow of the overall plot, by adding limits that change over time because of the events of the story. So you could have a sword that gets longer when you make multiple hits in rapid succession, or gets sharper every time it's used to kill someone. There's a lot more examples of this method of adding and removing limits for just this one type of item, and you can use it for every type of item. A cloak that has improved defense when you dramatically swish it behind you, but only if you also say a cool one-liner every time you do it. A suit of armor that absorbs every hit, taking no damage, but instead becomes slower and heavier every time, until you can't move in it at all. A bag that gains extra storage capacity the longer of a distance you travel with it. Limits are fun because they make things go wrong for your characters and create situations they have to think their way out of. Like that guy with the bag I mentioned earlier, he might have to take the long way round when travelling to the site of a heist, just so he can fit everything he wants to steal into it. And that creates opportunities for things to happen along the way. With this way of thinking, you get the expanded possibilities from Magic, the exciting and imaginative scenarios that they allow to happen, but you also have the limits and the new problems that they introduce, and all the fun you can have with the interesting ways your characters try to overcome those problems. It's striking the right balance between possibilities and limitations, looking at both sides of how you can take reality and twist it, that creates the most interesting and unique works of fiction. And if you are now yearning for a story including a ton of interesting magic items, then I have a recommendation for you. It's called Worth the Candle. It's a free web novel available online. The magic items in this story use limits in the way I have described, and it does it brilliantly. I'm going to leave a link to that below if you want to check that out. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you next time.